All right, good evening. My name is Jim Ostrowski. I work in the Eagles Environmental Support Division, and I welcome you to tonight's public information session on the Enbridge Line 5 application for proposed tunnel construction involving wetlands impacts. This is the second public meeting we've held on this topic. The other one was held on the 10th, I believe, of September at 1 o'clock. So this is our evening session. Just going to go over a few housekeeping guidelines. For those of you who've not joined us before for a virtual meeting, just a couple things to run through. First of all lines are muted, means you can hear us, but at the moment we can't hear you. We will open the lines up a little bit later on for those that want to make a comment or ask a question. We also are recording this webinar, and we will share that recording at a later date. In terms of the agenda for this evening, we got a short introduction, welcome by our division director. We also got a presentation that Joe Haas will give from Eagle, and then we're going to open it for questions. And we'll take as many questions as you got, pretty much. So if you got a question, now's the time to ask it. Well, not now, but during this webinar is the time to ask your questions because we have staff here that'll do their best to answer those questions. And here's how to ask a question in Zoom. If you're not familiar with Zoom webinar, you can type your question into the question box on your Zoom toolbar you have in front of you. You can also click the raise hand icon, and we will open up your line during the Q&A part to ask your question verbally. We don't have anybody on the phone yet, but for those that do join on the phone, you just hit *9 to ask a question. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Teresa. So Teresa, are you there?
I'm here. Thanks, Jim. So good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Teresa Seidel, the Water Resources Division Director, and we're thankful that you've taken the time out of your evening to join us for this public meeting. This is the second public meeting, as Jim identified, for the application for Part 303 Wetlands and 325 Bottomlands, the application that was submitted by Enbridge for consideration. So that's what we'll be talking about this evening, the 303 for the wetlands and 325 for bottomland disturbances. We need to be clear that Eagle doesn't regulate pipelines, but we do regulate the disturbances or the use of our resources. So it's important that you understand that and that you have an opportunity to get your opinion heard during the public hearing portion, which will be in a few weeks, but to make sure that you get any questions you have answered tonight. I have several staff here that are experts in their areas, and they can answer just about anything you throw at them. We also have some staff from Enbridge that are with us tonight too, that if there's something that we haven't already considered or thought of, or it's a question that's just maybe a little bit different or out of the scope of the application, that potentially we can call on the staff from Enbridge to answer those questions. Please note that the public comment period has been extended until October 19th. That is the final point to be in which you can submit your comments, and that'll be open until 11:59 on October 19th. It's a Monday. Please get your comments to us either through the My Waters portal, which will have the link for you, or through a regular, just write a letter to us or write your comments to us and put them in the mail, and we'll have that address for you too, so you'll have both opportunities. Either way is fine. We prefer My Waters because it's just easier for you, I think, and it goes directly into the portal, so your comments will just be uploaded directly into the system. And again, just thank you for joining us tonight. We're glad you were able to take some time to go through this public meeting, but please make sure you ask any questions you have. I want to make sure we're answering whatever it is that you're concerned about. So thank you for joining us, and we'll go back to Jim and we'll start the presentation from Joe Haas.
All right, thanks, Teresa. Next up, we got Joe Haas. So Joe, are you there?
I am.
All right, so Joe's going to give us his presentation. I'll let you take control of the screen, Joe. Share your slides.
Yes, sir. There's always that one extra button in Zoom that I'm not used to.
All right, you got it, man. Ready to go.
See that?
Yep, ready to go.
Okay, good. So we're here to talk about the Enbridge Energy Line 5 proposal in the Straits of Mackinac for a tunnel and the associated infrastructure with that. This is the resource submission number HNY NHX4-FSR2Q. And that's pretty cryptic, but it'll be in a couple different spots here. And with any luck, you could get to that pretty easily. That's a number that you can key into the MyWaters database and get to this application and the materials associated with it. So again, there's the resource submission number there. This is my contact information, and this is again being recorded. So if you need to get a hold of me, there's a good email address for me there. And if you wanted to submit comments, as Teresa suggested, the possibility of emailing them, you could email them directly to me if you cared to, but there is also a specific Enbridge Line 5 tunnel email box that we have set up, and there'll be links to that at the end of this presentation. So for today's presentation and discussion, we're going to talk about the resource program application. So this is the other part of the Enbridge application materials that will be reviewed by Water Resources Division. We're split into two sort of disciplines, with the surface water folks being the NPDES permit application and permit review, and now the resource program application that we're talking about this evening. And we hope to talk about the permit authorities, the resource application review, and also the joint aspect of this this geography in the Straits. It's covered under federal jurisdiction as well as state jurisdiction. So the Army Corps of Engineers as well as the Eagle Water Resources Division. We'll briefly talk about, I think I have one slide on the processing timeline, and then the tunnel application proposal. And at the end, we'll get into the links for the online database and a couple of images on where you want to click to provide public comments. So tonight is September 21st. So that is the meeting we're in from 6 to 9. We can go until 9 if we need to. Hopefully we don't have to go that long. And then following this evening, coming up, October 1st and October 8th are virtual public hearings. And that's your opportunity to provide additional comment on the record in a more public forum, say, than providing comments just into MyWaters. There's not a lot of difference as far as how they're considered. It's just a different methodology for providing comments. And again, till October 19th, Teresa just covered that, so I won't belabor that point too much. 325 and 303 are our two authorities that are of interest and in play here, if you will, for the resource permits. And for the Corps of Engineers, traditionally navigable waters. I think, Ann, this might be your slide. If you're ready, I'll hand it off to you.
Sure. Hi, I'm Ann Garwood. I'm in the Water Resources Division as well, assisting on the review of this application. I work out of Lansing. We provide a lot of technical support to the district offices. And in this case, I'm assisting with some of the coordination with historic preservation review as well as rare species. Just a little bit of information about the program more broadly. As Joe mentioned, we do have both state jurisdiction and federal jurisdiction reviewing this application for the resource impacts. In Michigan, you may know that we administer the Clean Water Act Section 404 for much of the state, but in these areas shown in red around the coast, we do share that jurisdiction with the Corps of Engineers. So they are processing this application on the federal side, and we are processing it on the state side, administering it under state review only. So just to keep in mind that those two processes are not exactly the same, but they are very similar and they are both happening right now. A little bit about how decisions have to be made under the statutes we administer on the state level. They do, if we issue permits, they do carry with them some other authorizations, and they do incorporate those coordinations I mentioned. So if a permit was to be issued, it would carry with it the 401 certification, coastal zone certification, and we would have coordinated on the screening and coordination with state and federal endangered species programs, as well as the State Historic Preservation Office. So As for the State Historic Preservation Office coordination, we have notified them of this project and provided copies of application materials as well as links to where to find the additional documents and comments that are submitted in My Waters. SHPO is reviewing the project to determine whether or not they need to provide comments or request any additional information in this area. So their review is ongoing and it will likely take some time. It's pretty likely that they will provide at a minimum some comments. We are also coordinating with state and federal agencies administering protection of threatened and endangered species. In this case, there's dwarf lake iris and is it Houghton's goldenrod at play, which are federally listed species. And there are some state listed species as well. We are coordinating their review of both the impacts and the proposed plans for mitigating those impacts to these rare species with those agencies. That is also ongoing at this time. When a decision is made under our state statutes, there are a lot of things that have to be considered. Some of the main categories of what needs to be considered before we can make a determination is listed on this slide. We do have to consider whether the project would be in the public interest, whether a permit would be otherwise lawful, whether a permit would be necessary to realize the benefits from the activity, that there would be no unacceptable disruption to aquatic resources, and that the proposed activity is either wetland dependent or that there are no feasible and prudent alternatives to the project. Still muted, Joe.
Unmute. Sorry. Thanks, Ann. Appreciate your work, and I think I've got it from here. So the resource application review involves, in this case, for the specific work that's being proposed by Enbridge, work at Point La Barbe. There's dredge fill in regulated wetlands on the north side of the straits, largely for the Boulevard Drive. That's the name of the drive. It's kind of named twice, right? Boulevard Drive widening, and the installation of shoreline outfall structures right at the intersection of the lake and the land along the coastline. And then Part 325 impacts. So the tunnel itself, the 20-foot inside finished diameter tunnel, about 3.6 miles long, and I say about because it's you could say 4 miles. It's been represented in the application as 3.58, but generally around 3.6 miles long. In the Straits of Mackinac that connects McGulpin Point, which is the lower peninsula portal point, in the direction they're going to start, the point they're going to start, and work to the north to Point La Barbe in the upper peninsula. And also there's work proposed to construct 2 water intake structures within the straits on bottomlands, one on either side of the straits. Single discharge pipe is proposed at the south. I think these are all proposed for removal upon tunnel completion. So they are somewhat temporary, but because the project is going to be in construction for such a long time frame, probably 5 years, potentially more, we don't consider this necessarily a temporary impact. So it's part of the permit review process. And then the timeline. So much of this is passed already. We're here September 21st for the second of the 2 information meetings and question and answer. Then we move into October with the public hearings. On October 1st is the first resource public hearing, and then October 8th. Again, October 19th is the deadline for public comment, and then we hope to make final resource decisions in early December. And so 10,000-foot view here just to set the stage so we all can agree, or at least have a sense of where we're talking about, the location at the straits where the work is proposed, the location for the new tunnel. The yellow line here is the highway I-75 and the existing Mackinac Bridge. This is the present location of the 2 20-inch, the dual 20-inch diameter pipelines that are currently at the bottom of the straits, either resting on the bottom or supported by screw anchors. And then to zoom in just a little bit, although this might be hard for some to see because it's rather not zoomed in, if you will, but the landward work areas are in blue here. So the north at Point LaBarbe, you see the area that's circled in blue, and then the line going to the north, that's Boulevard Drive that goes to the north, and then the relative limits of disturbance here at the north. And then at the south at McGulpin Point, as well, you see the boxes here showing Enbridge limits of disturbance or work areas, with maybe one exclusion area in the center there. That small box, I think, is maybe owned by somebody else. But that's the proposed work areas that are not in the straits proper. So again, to focus on the starting point here. So McGulpin Point is at the south side of the straits. And this is the landward work area. So the straits are here. The lake proper is to the north of this image. And then moving south, you see these thin yellow lines are the limits of work area for the McGulpin Point construction site. And this is where the portal would be started and installed, and the work with the tunnel boring machine largely initiated and worked from. And to the north then, jumping to the north side of the straits at Point LaBarbe. So the yellow line now is Boulevard Drive coming in. Not all of that is impact, but just to show you the roadway coming in. And then this white area here is the North Straits facility, the Enbridge North Straits facility, and then the limits of potential disturbance shown outlined in the yellow orange here. So here's the conceptual ideas for the water intakes. And this is shown as though maybe you were looking east across the straits. So to the right would be McGulpin Point, or the south side. And on the left is a diagram showing the north side, or Point LaBarbe. And so there's an approximately 280-foot pipe that comes out approximately that long, and the intake point, which this is the screen and the intake filter and structures that would be laid on bottomlands and marked by a buoy. And these again are considered somewhat temporary, but they're going to be reviewed under a permit as though they were permanent, just because of the time frame that they'll be in, certainly for more than one season. And the same with the south, the general similar construction. Distance is a little farther, 350 feet out from the shoreline. Similar structures with the filter and the intakes. Just to describe this diagram maybe a little better, the top shows the structures. The middle shows the plan view or overhead views superimposed on aerial photography. And then the bottom is sort of a cross section, as though you were looking at it sideways, with the substrate at the bottom and then the lake above that. And then the red line here being the intake structure, and the stationing or the distancing shown at the bottom. Jumping back to the north to Point LaBarbe. So Boulevard Drive comes in from the north, and the red areas are wetland impact areas, very thinly shown on this diagram that's zoomed out a bit, and I'll show you a little closer on a couple of the next following slides. But this is the overview that gives you an idea of, a little bit of impact here, this is W3, so this is the 0.03 of acres of impact here. And then most of the rest is largely for widening areas of Boulevard Drive access. So zooming into the Enbridge valve yard, and the little bit of fill at the north edge of that, and then a little bit of wetland impact with an outfall here, potentially a little bit of impact with the outfall here, and W12 again, a sliver of impact. And that's what we see coming in from the north. Is this is Boulevard Drive to the north, and some small areas of impact immediately adjacent to the existing roadway. I think 13 is probably the largest impact if we Look at this, the next slide will show you the zoomed in view of the table that shows the impacts. Yeah, so 13 is 0.08, the one I was just discussing, just mentioned. So roughly a total of 0.13. This might be reduced a bit by the time we get to a permit, but we'll see how that plays out. We're always looking at minimizing impacts. That's really our mantra. We look at avoid, minimize, and mitigate wetland impacts in that order. And so that for those that aren't familiar with wetland terminology, PFO is the palustrin forested or palustrin scrub wetland types, which is woody wetland forested swamp type. So that's mainly the impacts adjacent to the road is that scrubby wetland. A lot of tag elder in here as far as the main species go. And then PEM would be palustrin emergent, which is herbaceous marsh, a fen or wet meadow. And this is largely what we have in this area is herbaceous marsh. So really just a total of 0.2 of impacts to that. And this was not part of the initial public notice materials, but subsequently provided after some of our earlier information meetings and requests for more information and more potentially digestible, if you will, and maybe that's not the best term to use, but more accessible information regarding the geotechnical work that's been done across the straits. Not a lot of geotechnical information available for the Straits of Mackinac. It's really focused on the work that was done when the bridge was built, the Mackinac Bridge, and the work that was focused in the areas where the bridge pilings were placed. So this area to the west, Enbridge has done geotechnical borings, and that's reported out in a over 3,000 page geotechnical report that is available through the State of Michigan Enbridge Tunnel website, as well as through MyWaters, it's in the database. And this is a few page long, this is an excerpt of a few page long information, I might say cliff notes of that report that's been provided. So we've got the overhead view, the plan view showing the general layout of where that pipeline would lay across the straits. So again, sort of looking down on it, to the right would be the south or McGulpin Point. And then it would cross the straits. To the left is Point La Barbe and Enbridge's facility. And then, so the true scale in the middle is this thin diagram with the multiple colors showing the different rock formations. And so that's a depiction of how it looks in reality if you were to take a real cross section. It's kind of spread out and looks thin across the Earth's crust because this is, over 4 miles of a distance. And it's typical for us in our analysis and in engineering plans to do a vertical exaggeration to more easily depict these or more easily interpret how they might be impacted and the potential infrastructure that would be superimposed on them. And so again, the southern launch portal at McGulpin Point here, showing the proposed tunnel going through the Bois Blanc rock formation and then St. Ignace rock formation into the Point O'Shane rock formation, which is, this is the bedrock. Keeping below any of this overburden, this glacial till material. At the deepest point, it looks like 371 feet. That looks like the top of the tunnel. So the bottom of the tunnel is what, another 21, so 392 feet at the bottom. But in the whole span, maintaining it now in bedrock and beneath any of this glacial till that's loosely less consolidated, let's say that. And over to the Point La Barbe receiving shaft, which is the vertical shaft that the tunnel boring machine would be removed from, and the connections could be made in that area. And this is a slide I added from the previous presentation from earlier in September. So this is just a cross section of the proposed tunnel. This is how it could look. It's not necessarily exactly how it will look, but there's the 30-inch pipeline, the 21-foot diameter tunnel, precast linings placed by the tunnel boring machine, and different trays for different infrastructure running across. Other utilities can potentially also be placed in here. Electrical cables, communication cables, and then it's also affording a tunnel access for vehicles. And then on to the comment information. So you can get to the public notice through this super cryptic link to My Waters. Regrettably, it's long. I wouldn't expect anybody to write that down. We can get you a link that you can click on or cut and paste into your URL and get right to that, to those documents that you might view, and also the location where you would provide comments. You don't need a My Waters account. You don't need to provide us any personal information necessarily, but you can provide comment through this link. And then I've referenced already in this presentation a couple of times the State of Michigan Line 5 website. So this has some of the other agencies in it included. MPSC is one of those. I think MDOT as well. And Eagle has a prominent place, and our information is available. It's much of the information presented, and certainly I think the geotechnical report is there. I know I verified that it was able to be downloaded this morning. Somebody had a question, and just following up on that, we checked it out. It looks like it. You've got to be patient with it because it's a rather large document, over 3,000 pages. You got to have a good internet connection if you want to download that geotechnical report. So be prepared to, even if you do have those things, to wait a few minutes. It took me maybe 5 minutes to download it and have a copy that I could view. And then you want to sign up to the Eagle calendar, you can go to Eagle Connect. So if you go to that link to the My Waters website that I just, that was at the top of that previous slide, or the center, this is where it'll take you. It'll open up the details page. It has the details of the application name, number, the processor, and then public notice materials. You can click on the Documents tab to view all the materials that were available and posted with the public notice. A lot of that material I just went through, but there are some additional materials that weren't included in this presentation. So I'd encourage you to go there if you propose to comment or thinking you might want to comment. Look at that material. And when you want to add a comment, you simply click on this tab, and it will allow you to enter a comment directly into My Waters. You can also attach materials. If you've already composed a document, say in Microsoft Word, or have a PDF, you can upload that material. So be mindful of that. You don't have to retype it. We're trying to save you the trouble of that. If you also entering it directly into My Waters eases our burden of review a bit. If you email comments, we're going to have to upload them into the My Waters database to have them all in one place. So, or if you mail them in, we'll have to scan them and do the same. So it's a little more work, but whatever method you use, your comments will be considered. And that's a good segue to this slide. So commenting on our actions in general, any comments you provide will be accepted. We don't refuse comments. We don't say, no, that's out of the scope of our review. If you can make an argument or connection to the file, and even if you don't, if you provide comments to this file, they are accepted into the file. I would encourage you to provide comments that are focused on our ability to review the laws and rules, the facts, and the regulatory basis for our decision making are really where you want to focus your comments. This is not like a democratic process where we're taking a vote, where numbers of people saying they don't like a project don't necessarily mean it will be denied. We have to run it through our permitting process, and that will determine whether a project is permitted or not. So just some bullets here. Explain how the activity conforms to or violates program regulations or law. And again, that's part 325 and part 303 for wetlands impacts. These are the statutory authorities that form the basis for our permit actions. We only have the authority to approve or deny actions based on these regulations. So again, simply because somebody doesn't want the project to be constructed is not a factor that can be considered. You need to have cogent and to the point comments. So I would suggest try to comment on the technical merit or the degree to which you can provide additional information that we might not have. There was a good question in the last question and answer we had about providing comments and how to potentially do that. If you have firsthand knowledge of the site, that's good information to have. We don't necessarily spend a lot of time at these locations. I certainly am familiar with them, but I would urge you to provide direct information that you have regarding the site or the resources or the regulations. And here's the Line 5 website. Again, reference, this is what it looks like. I've superimposed this link on here just to simplify your access if you are interested. So again, MPSC, Michigan Public Service Commission, Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, EGLE, and MDOT, the Michigan Department of Transportation, the Corridor Authority has a link here. And just some more links. One that's a little bit outdated, but you might look at if you're considering public comment and you are maybe floundering a little bit or unsure of how to provide public comment. You can go to this link, Michigan Public Involvement Handbook. It's got some advice on how to review and provide input into our permit process. I think that's the end for me.
All right. Thanks, Joe. I'm gonna bring the screen back to me here. So just a minute. All right, everybody. So thanks, Joe, for a good presentation. At this point, what we're going to do is look at questions that we're getting from our attendees, and we've got a few already in. I want to remind people how to ask a question. If you'd like to ask a question, you can type it into the question box on your Zoom toolbar. You can also click the raise hand icon and we'll call on you. You can also, I don't think we have anybody on the phone, believe it or not, today. I'm looking, and if people were on the phone, you can hit *9 if you're on the phone only, but it doesn't look like we have any phone only callers. So yeah, so we're going to go to Q&A, and I want to give a chance for our panelists to introduce themselves. So could panelists all, I guess, turn on your cameras? And for those we haven't met yet, we've met Joe and Teresa and Ann. So Luis, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Luis Saldivia. I am one of the field operations manager that we have in the Water Resources Division. I handle the Lakes, Michigan and Superior, and hence this project is on the Straits. So that's why I'm here tonight.
And James.
Hi, my name is James Clift. I am one of the deputy directors at EGLE.
All right, thanks. So those are our EGLE panelists tonight to help answer your questions. So now is the time to ask your questions. We got a good team here, a great team of EGLE specialists that can help answer your questions. We got a few of them that are in. So the first one, I don't know, Joe, it's how long is the tunnel construction expected to take? And does that timing incorporate possible issues that arise that would delay boring?
Yeah, so I think their proposed ambitious time frame would be 5 to 7 years. 5 years on the short end, 7 on the longer end. But I don't think, I can't speak to any issues that might arise as far as incorporating that. I think to some degree that's anticipated, but I can't speak to that, and I'm hesitant to say anything else than that.
All right. Next question. What was the response from the indigenous community during the tribal input period? Or where can we read that? Who wants to
I
address
don't,
that one?
I might reach out. I don't know, Teresa or somebody else who is involved in that as well. I don't know that we've had necessarily a response from the indigenous community. They asked certainly a lot of good questions, and I think they gave us a little bit of homework to do, and we responded with some answers after the tribal consultation. I think they continue to ask good questions. We're glad to have them involved. They are probably some of the more well-informed as far as the actual sites and using the resources that are out here. I know I've encountered their staff when they've used the boat launch that's sort of an informal boat launch at the south end of Point LaBarbe. So I know they're out in the resource and have that firsthand knowledge. But you know, they haven't necessarily offered, as far as a response. You know, this is an application for a permit, so it's not like we're asking them questions; they're asking us questions. So I don't know. Anybody else have any other more cogent comments to offer? That's about all I have.
I was just going to add that a few of them we know have been working on preparing some written comments. And so I think that just like the rest of the public who's planning to prepare some written comments and submit them, you know, that is ongoing. I think that we expect to receive at least a few, if not quite a few, comments in writing from the tribes. But they are still kind of taking their time to really understand the application and look at the best way to express their comments.
Thanks, Ann.
All right, thank you. And I want to mention too that in the chat, in your Zoom chat, we've sent out several links that you might want to access. So up on the screen now, there's a bunch of links, but there's the direct links right in the chat if anybody's interested in checking those out, so you have to write them down. Okay, next question. Won't the water intakes freeze solid January through March, or will the use and work with those be suspended during the winter months?
Sorry, I'm thinking that must be a question for me as a default. It goes
Yeah,
to me,
I
right?
was thinking that. Yeah, Joe.
Yeah, I think, I mean, if we look back at the diagrams, I think you're looking at 17 plus feet of water, and I don't know that we get that much ice depth in the straits. That's a really flowing system. It's almost riverine, if you will, and it changes direction and it swirls around. You know, the flow and currents in the straits are infamous for being very dynamic. So I don't think, and if it, you know, Enbridge is not proposing to stop work, right? This is going to be work that's proposed probably 24/7 as long as they're able, or, you know, something akin to that, really maybe, you know, 6 days a week or something to that effect. And we could always reach out to them right now and ask if we wanted to, but I don't know that's necessary at this point. But I don't think they will freeze solid. I think the currents will keep them. I mean, they get certainly surface ice and some good thickness of ice out here. But they could always install you know, a thermal or a heat, sort of a heat tape around them, if you will, like you would with a cabin in a electric water or electric heat tape around your water pipes. So there's ways to mitigate that. I don't think that's. I think it's an engineering solution that's doable.
All right, thanks, Joe. How much water per second or minute will be sucked into the intake pumps? And how will the discharged water be disposed of?
Yeah, somebody's got a better memory than me. This is an NPDES or surface water question from the other group. They've been answering this question. I don't remember.
It's actually covered under the MPDS permit.
Yep.
It's less than 2 million gallons per day. And I can't give you the exact number because it's not coming to me right now either. But it's less than 2 million gallons per day because that's sort of where the cutoff line is. So I know it's under the line where they need a 327 permit from us. But that water will be pulled in and used in the tunneling operation. And then it'll be processed. Any material that comes back, whether it's in the slurry form, really processed in, I'm going to call them lagoons, but kind of like storage bins while it's deflocculated so that the sediment falls out, and then make sure that they meet the discharge limits that are part of the NPDES permit. And I don't have that slide presentation on me very readily. But if you want to go and look at the public meetings that have already been held for the NPDES permit, the answers to that specific question are actually on those recordings. And we can send you those links. They're on our YouTube page, and we can put one of the links in the chat box for you. But that question's been asked in both of those public meetings and responded to there, so you can get the specific details. The NPDES staff are not with us tonight, and it's just jumping off my mind. I can't remember the exact number, but it is under the 2 million gallon per day threshold.
All right, thanks, Teresa. And so Matt Tomlinson's been sending out chat messages, and I don't know if maybe Matt could, if he gets a chance, go out there and look to see if you can find that link for YouTube for the recording from one of the NPDES Enbridge sessions. So we'll put it in the chat if we can find it.
I'll send it to Matt. I just literally sent those
Okay.
out about 15 minutes before the meeting.
Great. We'll put that in the chat then. Thank you. All right, so next one is probably for all of you, or start with Joe, and that's, what is Eagle doing to ensure Enbridge minimizes environmental impacts?
Well, yeah,
A broad
just generally
question.
generally that's part of our, that's our process. That's what we do, right? Like I mentioned it during the presentation a minute ago with wetland impacts, we look at, and all impacts, honestly, it's avoid, minimize, mitigate is sort of the trident that we, the trident mantra, if you will, that we advise applicants. If they can avoid impacts, that's the preferred option. If they can't avoid them, then they need to minimize impacts. And that's pretty straightforward, right? Minimize the footprint, minimize the resource impacts, and the primary and secondary impacts. So, and then if that's not possible, then we start looking at mitigation in some cases. In this case, the mitigation, Enbridge has proposed a couple of alternatives to mitigate wetland impacts, even though the total wetlands proposed to be impacted are less than 1/3 of an acre. And we have the ability under our regulations to waive the requirements for wetland mitigation when it's that minimal, when it's less than 1/3 of an acre. But we've not gone down that road with Enbridge here. I think we'd like them to mitigate for all impacts here, and we've held that line. So they've been looking at wetland mitigation. So that's one of the things. We do have what's in Rule 15 of Part 325 is our environmental assessment, and that really walks through some of the environmental impact minimizing methodology. I mean, it's pretty high level review or high level document or paragraph, but talks about adverse impacts to the environment, public trust, riparian interests, adjacent owners are minimal and will be mitigated to the extent possible. That there's no feasible and prudent alternatives. So that's another issue that another aspect of permitting that we look at. Look at feasible and prudent alternatives to what's proposed that are consistent with the reasonable requirements of public health, safety, and welfare. I'm not sure if that completely answers your question, but that's generally how our process looks at minimizing environmental impact.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Moving on, and this might be a question for Anne. I don't know, what is going to happen to the protected plants that are on the sites on both sides of the crossing?
Let me jump in real quick.
Sure.
There's only protected plants on the north side. There's no T&E species that have been identified on McGulpin Point. Really limited to Point LeBarbe. So I don't know if you can answer the rest of that, Ann, or not. Let me know if you can.
I was just going to say, so there is a mitigation plan that's been proposed by Enbridge. It's under review by the state and federal agencies who oversee the protection of these species. We're in communication with them and coordination to ensure that our review is able to either incorporate their requirements or sufficiently address the need to get those approvals in place before the work happens. But ultimately, we aren't the agency that administers protection of rare species. We coordinate with those agencies. So they are reviewing the proposed mitigation plan, and they're in conversations about potential modifications that may be necessary, but it'll be those agencies making that decision, really.
Thanks, Ann.
All right. I got a couple more questions in here. Just want to remind people, if you want to ask your question, go ahead and do so now. Type it in or click the raise hand icon. You can also see Matt did drop in the links to the recordings from the past public information sessions we've held on both the MPDS public meetings and the last one we did for this permit application, the resource permitting. So you can find those right there. You can copy them and watch them later if you want. Okay, this two-part question looks like. It says, if heat tape is used in the winter months, how will that affect water quality? And
Yeah,
will
that's what I
Enbridge
get.
have, go ahead.
So I'll take this.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So Enbridge is not proposing to use heat tape. Enbridge is just proposing to have a pipe that's deep enough in the water that it wouldn't freeze. That's the intent. And I think that if it were to freeze, obviously that would change the source of water for Enbridge, and they would probably have to make some other condition in order to be able to have water to continue the tunneling. And that's the reason for the water. You need the water in order to make the slurry for the tunneling machine to move through the bedrock. So if we get to that point, that'll be a different decision point for Enbridge. The pipe to bring in the water from the straits is deep enough that it should not freeze. But if it were to freeze, let's say we have some kind of climate activity that creates it to freeze, then Enbridge would likely have to come up with a different water source and be able to continue their tunneling operations. That's the reason for the depth and the distance out for the intake and outlets.
That's what I get for speculating. Sorry.
Yeah, because the rest of that question was, will Enbridge have to submit additional information? So if it was part of the application, or if they did use heat tape and it wasn't in the application, they would have to submit additional information, right?
Yeah,
Absolutely,
and just like the geotechnical report, right? That's a huge document, and we asked them, please submit additional information and something that's more digestible and accessible to most people. And just, they didn't have to do that. They could have dug their heels and said, no, we're not going to do that. But, I think it's in their interest to do that. And so, yes, I wouldn't stick very heavily on the word have to, but certainly it's in their interest. If we ask for more information, they generally would be interested in providing that or work to do that.
And Jim, while we're waiting for additional questions to come in, it might be a good time for us to kind of talk about the public hearing process, because it is different than the public meeting process. So when we host the public hearings, which shall be, I think, the last week of September and the first 2 weeks of October, there's 4, 2 for the MPDS and 2 for the permit we're talking about tonight, the application for the resource permit. Those are hearings. And so what happens is they're not very interactive. It won't be like this where you're asking questions. You will literally come up to the virtual mic if you choose to participate and want to get your comments on the record that way. You'll raise your hand, Jim will call on you, and he can kind of walk you through that process. But we do not interact with you during that time. So this is really the opportunity to get your questions answered. During the hearing, it's truly an opportunity for you to put your comments on the record. And it's very formal, and it's not very friendly, because it truly is just you coming up to the mic, putting your comments, us acknowledging the comments, and then using those comments to help foster a decision on whether to issue a permit or not. So your comments are very important to get on the record, but I just want you to be clear that it isn't this very interactive process. So Jim, maybe you want to talk a little bit about how it does it virtually. We haven't used Zoom in this for a water one yet, I don't believe. Or maybe we have one or two.
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. On the screen, I got the upcoming hearings and when they're going to be, 29th, the 1st, 6th, and 8th. And so, yeah, and I guess the important thing also to remember is that they're 2 separate hearings. So you've got a hearing to deal with the MPDS, the wastewater discharge aspects. That's one hearing. Then you got another one that deals with what we're talking about tonight, which is the potential bottomlands and wetlands impacts. Now, if you were to come to the public hearing the 29th for MPDS, the wastewater, and submit a comment related to the wetlands, we'll still take it. But I mean, it's just they're two separate permitting actions, and so there's two separate times. And yeah, as far as it goes, we usually open it up the hearings with some pretty basic instructions, some housekeeping kind of details. We might read off some official statements, and then what we do is you just type. You can either type in your comment, like the question box we have here, and indicate it's a comment, or you click the raise hand button, and we call on you, and we give you 3 minutes or whatever we decide to make your comment. You have that much time to make your comment, and it's recorded for the record. So that's how we do it. All right, team. I'm looking for more hands raised, and I do not see any questions popping in there. And I don't know if there's anything else that any questions that have come up in the past ones that you guys we didn't see here that you'd want to address either. I don't know, Joe, if you remember any of them from the last session or not. That might be of interest. I know a lot of people in the last session had questions about actually how much wetland will be impacted. But I know you had a slide up earlier that showed the amount, and it's not, I don't know how much actually is. And you're muted, Joe.
I prefer to talk when I'm muted, apparently.
There you go.
0.13 acres total. So that's not very much wetland impact. So it's rather small. I think they've done a decent job of minimizing the impacts and taking the wetland seriously, at least with avoiding wetland impacts. So 0.13 is the total wetland impact area, with some of that even being considered temporary as far as what they've applied for. But I think we're going to consider it all because it's so minimal, so small.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Here's another question that's come in. How does the 401 certification process align with the resource permit?
Ann, do you want to answer that? I think that sounds like it might be somebody who's at least somewhat familiar with our process, and or just maybe familiar with the national or federal process and not the state's process.
Sure. Basically, our state statutes, in this case, it's 303 and 325, have to follow the 401 requirements in order, our decisions have to incorporate that. So if it's permittable under our state statutes, then it has satisfied the 401. The 401 is carried with that permit. This is a little different than in cases where a permit's not required under 303 or 301 and doesn't have that. Those kind of go through a different process to get that 401 certification. But in this case, it's sort of aligned. It's part of our review under our statutory criteria of these statutes.
All right, thanks, Ann. All right. I'm checking it out, and I do not see any other questions, guys. So I guess we can move to wrap it up. I don't know, Teresa or Joe, do either of you guys have any parting remarks you'd like to make tonight?
I would just sort of play off what Teresa's already said about the public hearing process. This process with our question and answer sessions is your opportunity to have questions answered. It's, to come into a public hearing and want questions answered, you're going to be frustrated because we don't generally do that. Now we could potentially have a short information session ahead of the public hearing. That's not unusual, and it's possible to do that. But for a whole evening of question and answer, that's not what a public hearing is. So it can be frustrating if people don't understand that. So you got to understand it's really a process where we are there to listen to your comments and have them entered into the record, into the formal record. Once the formal hearing starts, there's really no question and answer. And we often sense the frustration in the audience. So just know that going in. And if you provided comments already, you don't necessarily need to provide them again at the hearing. They will be considered in either case. It's not like a public hearing comment carries more weight. They're relatively equal as far as any consideration and review that we do. I don't know. Anybody else have any comments?
I was
No,
just going
just
to
get
add
your-
one thing. Oh, sorry,
Go ahead,
Teresa.
Ann. No, it's okay. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, in addition to the things you talked about that would be relevant comments for our review on whether or not this application should be approved for a permit, some other relevant comments that would be helpful are, we have the ability when a permit is issued to write conditions to sort of further minimize any environmental impacts. And so, any comments or proposals that could help us ensure that the conditions that would be placed on any permit that would be issued to be appropriate would be good comments. For example, stabilizing with native vegetation and things like that. So those are just examples of other relevant comments in addition to the statutory review criteria on whether or not this should be approved.
Thanks, Ann.
All right. Okay, and Joe, just to make sure we're clear, the public comment period ends on what date?
You're testing me, aren't you?
Actually, no, because I don't want to remember. Is it September or
October
October.
19th.
Oh my gosh, you too. October 19th.
October 19th, 11:59 p.m.
October 19th. All right.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
want to make sure that was clear. All right. So that was all we have for questions and comments. Make sure you check out the chat if you haven't already to grab those links if you need to. And a couple parting housekeeping items. Just want to let you all know that tonight's webinar was recorded and we'll post it as soon as we can on the Line 5 website. Which you see in front of you, michigan.gov/line5. You'll see it there along with a lot of other good information, including a fact sheet and links to other documents that you might want to check out. Other than that, I want to thank everyone, our panelists that are here tonight, as well as all of you for taking time on a beautiful evening, looks like outside, to be with us here tonight and ask your questions and listen in. So thank you all for a great evening. Enjoy the rest of your evening too. Thank you.
Thank you.